Now I'm going to do a very short talk on Genesis chapter 5, and I'm just going to be really honest with everyone here. It's because I've made a mistake in the preaching calendar. And essentially, last week we finished chapter 4, and then today I've asked Rob to preach chapter 6. And so you may spot immediately there's an issue there. What about Genesis chapter 5? I just got my scheduling wrong. So I wanted to do 10 minutes on it this morning. You could think we're skipping it because it's not very important. It's one of those chapters that's got lots of names and lots of numbers. And you might think, oh, it's one of those ones, we don't care about those chapters. Let's get on to the good stuff. And I just want to say right from the start, that is not the case at all. And if I'd got this right, Rob would be preaching Genesis 5 today, and we would have an excellent sermon on Genesis 5. But there are just a few things I do want to share. God wrote this to teach us. And actually, this is the start of a whole new section of Genesis. So it's interesting, in the book of Genesis, you get this a number of times throughout the 50 chapters. It starts with this phrase, this is the book of the generations of. That's how we translate it. Yeah, if anyone would like a Bible.
Bible, need a Bible.
Thanks, Dad. It starts with this phrase, this is the book of the generations of. What that really means is, this is what came out of. This is what came out of. And he starts every new section of his book, Genesis, with this phrase, this is what came out of. So this book, Genesis 5, runs through to the start of chapter 6, and this is the book of what came out of Adam. And you might think, well, isn't that what we've just done? I mean, we've just had a number of chapters about Adam and Eve and how they had Cain and Abel. Isn't that what we've just had? Well, that was actually a section called This is what came out of the creation of the heavens and the earth. So that section was about the first human beings, those first ones. This section now is about what came out of Adam longer term. And actually, we're going to see in this chapter, the next 11 generations are what we hear about now in chapter 5 through to the start of chapter 6. So it's a much fuller account. And this is actually the backdrop to what Rob is going to preach later. So Rob is going to preach Genesis 6, 1 to 8, which closes off this little book. And I'm going to read for us now chapter 5, which is all the backdrop to what Rob is then going to preach. So let me read it for you. Genesis chapter 5, starting at verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now there's so much there. Could easily do a whole sermon, but I just want to point out 6 things very, very quickly. I'm going to try and do about 30 seconds on each one. The first is that Genesis 1 to 2 continues. You might have noticed the language in those first verses about God making man, male and female, in his likeness. He blessed them and he named them. If you've read anything of Genesis 1 to 2 recently, you will know that is all language of those chapters when God made mankind. It's reminding us God is the first ancestor. But then did you notice it used the same wording of Adam, fathering Seth? It said that he fathered a son after his likeness in his image and named him Seth. So what the narrator is wanting us to know is that God continued his work through Adam. And here's the thing, there are so many lines we heard again and again, they had other sons and daughters, but God very clearly here wants us to follow one line through Seth to Noah. That's where we got to at the end. So the son listed is not Cain, it's not Abel, they're not even mentioned here. It is just Seth who's mentioned. And we follow that line all the way down to Noah. The third thing to mention is that it goes through many generations. Now you might remember, if you've read Genesis 3, that God promised Eve that she would have an offspring that was going to crush the serpent's head. And I think part of the tension of Genesis is thinking, who is it going to be? Is that offspring going to come? And here what we find is that we go through actually 11 generations, 10 from Adam to Noah, and then even on to Noah's children. So it gives us the impression we're probably going to have to wait for this serpent crusher. He's obviously not coming immediately. The other thing that's really important, which I was trying to emphasize, you may have noticed, is that every one of these generations died. And that's probably the thing I heard in a commentary that the Israelites would have most noticed. That curse of death is coming true. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. That is the real drumbeat through this chapter. You may have also noticed some quite surprising numbers along the way. Huge ages that seem so kind of bizarre to us today. Really quite hard to even believe they could possibly be true. There are a lot of different things written about this, a lot of ink spilled over these verses. And there are many theories. I think there are 4 primary ones. The first is they could be real. The second is that they actually counted years in a different way when they were counting these years. The third is that they're actually contrasting. Genesis is contrasting with other accounts around from other religions that would have been describing other ways that God made the world. And it's using these numbers to contrast with those. There's a whole lot of discussion about the Sumerian kings and how these numbers would have contrasted with those. And the other is that it's a way of storytelling. For example, Lamech living for 777 years is kind of like the perfect number for perfection and completeness. And that, if you were here last week and remember the Lamech we heard of in chapter 4, who was Cain's ancestor, is a direct contrast. You've got this one who was incredibly unrighteous and evil. And then the one in Seth's line lived 777 years, giving us a kind of hint of completion and perfection in this line. Now, the truth is, it's probably a mix of all these different things. But the real thing we've got to remember when we read Genesis is try not to read it through a 21st century Western lens, because it was not written by a 21st century Westerner. It was written at least 3,500 years ago by someone from the ancient Far East. And they would have a very different way of telling truth. We looked at this in Genesis 1. They would speak through symbols and real history combining together to describe truth. So there's other examples. It's exactly 10 generations from Adam to Noah. That is a perfect number of completeness. That might be exactly right, or it might be to make a point. Enoch, we heard about, and I'll say more on him in a second, is the 7th generation. And that is the best number in many ways. Often the favorite spot for the lead character will be in the 7th generation when they do these genealogies. And many of the names you might have noticed if you were remembering Genesis chapter 4 were the same as chapter 4, the same names. So again, it might be to contrast with Cain's line, who went so far away from God, showing us this line is now the contrasting line going with God. So there's a lot going on. I'm just trying to show you that. Try not to read it just through a 21st century Western lens. There's a lot in these names and these numbers. Lastly, I just want to say 2 exceptions. You probably noticed almost every paragraph was the same, except 2 times. The first is Enoch, this crazy story that Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. It seems as though he walked so closely with God that God just took him into his presence. It doesn't actually mention that he died. And we don't know. There's not a lot told to us. We get a bit more information in Hebrews, but it seems that death did not happen for Enoch. Why? Why tell us that? Well, it might again be to hint that in this line, there are hints and potential for real righteousness. And obviously we know as Christians these days, this is the line that eventually Jesus himself came through. The other exception is Noah. And Noah, his name sounds like the word in Hebrew for rest or relief. And you would have remembered his father Lamech named him that because he hoped Noah would relieve them from basically the curse from Genesis 3, the painful toil and hard work. So the question hanging over Noah as we go into this next section and then the section beyond is he going to be this one who will relieve us from this curse of Genesis 3? That's what we are going to be looking at. There's so much more to say. We could easily do a sermon about how Jesus is the ultimate one in this line, the ultimate one who will relieve us from the painful toil, the ultimate one who walked with God and yet died. There are so many things we could preach about the Lord Jesus from this chapter, and I just want you to see we're not skipping it because it's not important or not of great value. It is purely my error. But I hope that that is still helpful for you and sets the backdrop as Rob comes to preach from Genesis chapter 6 today. And if you'd like my notes from that, I'm very happy to share those with you.